betrayal, deception, revenge. Sophie returns home to find her house stolen by her own stepfather. But she's not going down without a fight. What happens next? Pure justice. Sophie had barely set foot back in Sydney when she knew something was wrong. After 3 grueling weeks away on a business trip, all she wanted was a hot shower, a meal, and the comfort of her own home. But as she turned onto her street, exhaustion gave way to a sickening wave of dread. There, planted firmly in her front lawn, was a bright red "Sold" sign. Her car screeched to a stop as her heart pounded against her ribs. No, this had to be a mistake. She hadn't put her house on the market. Clutching her keys in a trembling hand, she rushed up the front steps, only to find the door unlocked and slightly ajar. The unmistakable sound of tape ripping and boxes shuffling echoed from inside. She shoved the door open, and there, in the middle of her half-empty living room, stood Malcolm, her stepfather, packing up her belongings like he owned the place. He barely looked up, a smug smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Oh, you're back earlier than I thought," Malcolm said casually, sealing a box with an unnecessary flourish. Sophie's breath hitched in her throat. Her couch was missing, her dining table, gone. The walls were bare, and cardboard boxes lined the floors, filled with what little remained of her life. She dropped her bag with a thud. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, her voice sharp with panic. Malcolm let out an exaggerated sigh, as if she were the one inconveniencing him. "We sold it," he said, dusting his hands off. Sophie's stomach twisted. "We?" she echoed, stepping forward, her blood boiling. Malcolm finally looked up, his tone dripping with condescension. "Your mother and I obviously," he said. "Sophie, you don't need a house like this. It's ridiculous for someone your age. You should be renting a small apartment. Saving money. You'll thank me later." The casual dismissal sent a bolt of fury through her. "Malcolm, this is my house," she snapped. "I bought it. I paid for it. You had no right." Malcolm's laughter cut her off. It was cold, amused, and dripping with arrogance. "Oh, kid," he said, clapping her on the shoulder like she was some clueless child. "You really think you did this all on your own? You think you're some kind of self-made success story?" His grip tightened slightly, his voice lowering. "This is family money, shared assets. You don't actually own anything." Sophie recoiled like she had been struck. Family money? Shared assets? No, that wasn't true. It couldn't be. But Malcolm's smug expression told her otherwise. She forced her voice to stay steady. "Where's Mum?" Malcolm shrugged, grabbing the handle of a sleek leather suitcase and slinging it over his shoulder. "Already in Italy. Needed a little break." Sophie clenched her fists. "So you sold my house, took the money, and left me with what? Exactly?" "Oh, don't be so dramatic." Malcolm smirked, patting her cheek like she was a child throwing a tantrum. "You're young. You'll figure it out." Then, with an infuriating level of calm arrogance, Malcolm strolled past her toward the door, his suitcase in tow. "I'd love to stay and chat, but I've got a flight to catch. 5-star hotels, private tours, the works. First class, all the way." Sophie stood there, frozen in disbelief, as the front door swung shut behind him. The walls around her felt foreign, empty, like someone else's house. Because it wasn't hers anymore. It had been stolen from her. But as she stared at the bare space where her furniture used to be, a slow, cold determination settled in her chest. Malcolm thought he had won. He had no idea what was coming. Sophie had always been cautious with money. She worked tirelessly as an architect, pouring every spare dollar into her dream of homeownership. At 25, after years of scrimping and saving, she had finally purchased her beachfront house in Sydney, a symbol of her hard work, independence, and success. But the reality of homeownership at such a young age had come with complications. The bank had been hesitant to approve her mortgage without a co-signer. Despite her solid credit, that's when her mother, Isabel, had stepped in, offering Malcolm as a co-signer. "It's just paperwork, darling," Isabel had reassured her, waving off Sophie's concerns. "The house will always be yours." At the time, it had seemed harmless. She had trusted her mother, why wouldn't she? So, she signed the documents, never once imagining that 5 years later, that small act of trust would cost her everything. as Sophie stood in the empty shell of what used to be her home. Malcolm's words replayed in her mind like a twisted taunt. Shared assets. Family money. You don't own anything. Her skin burned with rage as she grabbed her laptop and pulled up her financial records. Desperate for an explanation, she scrolled through her mortgage history, her hands trembling as she read the words that made her stomach drop. Refinanced, primary owner, Malcolm Davenport. Her name was gone. She inhaled sharply, her chest tightening as she skimmed through the fine print. 3 months ago, while she had been working on a major project in Melbourne, Malcolm had refinanced the mortgage in his name only. He had legally removed her from the deed, making him the sole owner of the property. No notifications, no warning, just a quiet betrayal hidden beneath layers of legal jargon. Her pulse pounded in her ears. How was this even possible? The answer was buried in the fine print of the original mortgage agreement. Because Malcolm had been a co-signer, he had certain legal rights to the property. And while Sophie had been away for weeks at a time, trusting that her finances were in order, he had taken advantage of every loophole available. Without her knowledge, he had met with the bank, presented fraudulent documents, and signed off on the refinancing. And now, with his name alone on the deed, he had exercised his full legal authority to sell the house, her house. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat, her fingers trembling as she checked her bank accounts. She hadn't received a single dollar from the sale. Where was the money? She scrolled through the transaction history, each withdrawal making her nauseous. Luxury hotels, private jets, high-end shopping in Paris and Milan, a $150 wire transfer to an international account. They hadn't just stolen her house. They had already spent the money. She gritted her teeth, her nails digging into her palm as she slammed her laptop shut. All those years of sacrifice, all the late nights, all the projects she had poured herself into just to afford this house, gone in an instant. And the worst part? Her own mother had been complicit. Sophie's phone vibrated on the counter, and she snatched it up, her jaw tightening at the name flashing across the screen. Mum, she answered with a cold, clipped tone. Where is my money? A long sigh came from the other end. Sophie, sweetheart, please don't be so dramatic. Sophie's grip on the phone tightened. You stole my house. You sold it behind my back. And now I have nothing. And you expect me not to be dramatic? Her mother huffed impatiently, as if Sophie was a child throwing a tantrum. Darling, you work too much. That house was too big for you, it was a waste. Malcolm and I found a lovely little condo for you in the city. It's more manageable, more sensible. Sophie felt like she had been slapped. A condo? She let out a dry, humorless laugh. You stole my house and now you're trying to convince me this was a favor? Sophie, think of the bigger picture. Isabel pressed, her tone sickly sweet. We didn't take everything. A portion of the money was set aside for you. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. And the rest? She asked through clenched teeth. Silence. Then, in a carefully measured tone, Isabel admitted, a little went toward our trip. Sophie closed her eyes, rage simmering beneath her skin. A little? They had spent nearly $500,000 in weeks. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She wasn't going to scream. She wasn't going to break. Because while Malcolm and Isabel thought they had won, they had forgotten one thing. Sophie wasn't the type of woman to walk away from a fight. They had stolen everything from her. Now, it was her turn. Sophie had always been methodical. Her job as an architect demanded precision, patience, and the ability to see the bigger picture. If Malcolm thought she was going to crumble, he had made a fatal miscalculation. She wasn't just going to sit back and accept defeat. She was going to burn his world to the ground. But first, she needed a plan, sitting in the echoing emptiness of what used to be her home. Sophie grabbed her phone and made 3 calls. The first was to Mia, her best friend and a sharp, relentless solicitor. If there was even the slightest chance that Malcolm had committed fraud, Mia would find it. The second call was to Aunt Laura, a forensic accountant, who had always been wary of Malcolm and his so-called business ventures. Laura had resources and knowledge that Malcolm underestimated, and Sophie needed every advantage she could get. The third call wasn't to a person, but to a locksmith. If Malcolm could take what wasn't his, so could she. The first step was silence. Sophie didn't reach out to Malcolm. She didn't demand answers from her mother. She let them think she was broken, defeated, out of options. Meanwhile, Mia got to work. Within hours, she was poring over property records, financial documents, and legal filings. If Malcolm had forged Sophie's signature, if he had tampered with any documents in the refinancing process, then his sale of the house was invalid. If we can prove fraud, Mia said during a late-night call, we can freeze his assets. He won't be able to spend another cent. That was exactly what Sophie wanted. While Mia was pulling at the legal threads, Aunt Laura was digging into Malcolm's financials. Malcolm had always presented himself as a successful real estate investor, but Laura had never trusted him. Now, with full access to his accounts, thanks to some well-placed sources, she was beginning to see why. Undisclosed income, unreported offshore accounts, tax evasion. The more she uncovered, the worse it got. He's been laundering money, Laura informed Sophie, her voice tight with restrained anger. And if I make the right phone calls, he's about to have a serious problem with the Australian Taxation Office. Sophie leaned back in her chair, a slow, calculated smile spreading across her face. Make the calls. Then, there was the final step, something personal. Sophie knew that Malcolm was still living comfortably, enjoying his European tour, completely oblivious to the destruction that was about to rain down on him. But there was one small, critical detail he had overlooked. His credit was tied to Isabel. His access to money, his ability to refinance, his ability to sell, he had done all of it by using Isabel as leverage. And Isabel? She had no idea. Sophie didn't have to destroy Malcolm directly, she just had to plant a single seed of doubt in her mother's mind. A few well-placed words, a few subtle revelations, and Isabel would take care of the rest. Sophie sent a simple text. Mom, have you checked your credit report lately? I think you should. Less than an hour later, Isabel called, her voice panicked. Sophie, something isn't right. There are accounts I don't recognize. Loans I never agreed to. Sophie stayed quiet, letting the weight of her mother's words sink in. Then, calmly, she responded, you should talk to Malcolm about that. And she hung up. With legal pressure mounting, financial investigations underway, and Isabel starting to unravel, Sophie knew it was only a matter of time. Malcolm thought he had won. He had no idea his empire was already crumbling. For 2 weeks, Sophie stayed quiet. She didn't text. She didn't call. She didn't lash out in anger. She let Malcolm believe he had won. While he was sipping champagne in Paris, his world was collapsing behind his back. The first crack appeared when Mia called with an update. Sophie, we have him, she said, a rare note of excitement in her usually calm voice. He forged your signature on the refinancing documents. That makes the mortgage illegal. Sophie clenched her fist, feeling a thrill of satisfaction. What does that mean? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Mia didn't disappoint. It means that the sale of your house was fraudulent. We can file a lawsuit immediately, freeze his assets, and stop him from touching another cent. Sophie grinned. Do it. While Mia was working on the legal attack, Aunt Laura was delivering the financial death blow. It's worse than I thought, Laura admitted over the phone. Malcolm's been evading taxes for years. He's hidden at least $500,000 in offshore accounts. And I've already flagged it to the Australian Taxation Office. Sophie inhaled sharply. So, what happens now? Laura chuckled. They'll freeze his accounts. He'll be audited. And if the auto decides to pursue charges, he's looking at serious financial penalties or worse, prison. That was exactly what Sophie wanted. Then came the final move, her mother. Sophie hadn't spoken to Isabel since their last conversation, but she knew doubt had already begun to creep in. Isabel had been Malcolm's biggest supporter. But what happened when his empire started to crack? The answer came 3 days before Malcolm was due to fly back home. Sophie was sitting in her new apartment, drinking coffee, when her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Mom. She let it ring 3 times before answering. Sophie, we need to talk. Isabel's voice was tight with stress. Sophie sipped her coffee. About what? A pause. Then, in a hushed voice. Something's happening. Malcolm's accounts are frozen. I went to withdraw money yesterday, and the bank wouldn't let me. They said there's a dispute. And now, I just got a notice from the auto. They're auditing Malcolm. Sophie didn't say anything, letting the silence stretch between them. She could hear the panic in her mother's breath. Sophie, did you do something? Sophie set her mug down and leaned back in her chair. I didn't do anything, Mum, she said calmly. Malcolm did. You just didn't want to see it. Her mother exhaled sharply, but Sophie could hear the realization sinking in. The life Isabel had built with Malcolm was crumbling, and she was suddenly desperate to get out before she went down with him. 2 days later, Isabel froze their joint accounts and changed the locks on the penthouse. Malcolm had no idea. Then, the day finally arrived. Malcolm's flight landed at Sydney International Airport at 4:15 p.m. He stepped off the plane completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit him. He had spent the last 2 weeks living like royalty, 5-star hotels, Michelin-starred restaurants, shopping sprees in Milan. Now, reality was about to slap him in the face. At 4:37 p.m., Sophie sat in her car across the street from the penthouse. Waiting, she watched as a black luxury SUV pulled up to the curb. And Malcolm stepped out, dressed in an expensive coat, sunglasses perched arrogantly on his nose. He was still smiling, still smug, still thinking he was untouchable. Then, he walked to the front door, punched in the security code, and nothing happened. Sophie could see his confusion. He tried again, and again. Then, the door swung open, and there stood Isabel, even from across the street. Sophie could hear their voices. Linda, why isn't the code working? Malcolm demanded. Isabel folded her arms. We need to talk. Malcolm frowned. Just let me in. We can talk inside. He moved to step past her. But she blocked the doorway. Not out here, Malcolm. Not in there either. You don't live here anymore. Sophie almost laughed out loud at the way his entire face drained of color. What the hell are you talking about? Isabel's voice wavered slightly, but she held firm. I saw my credit report. I saw the accounts you took out in my name. The house, the money, all of it. I'm not going down with you. I already filed for divorce. And I froze our accounts. Malcolm looked like he had been physically struck. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, real panic flickered in his eyes. Then, as if on cue, his phone rang. He pulled it out, barely glancing at the number before answering. Hello? What do you mean my accounts are frozen? No. This has to be a mistake. What IRS notice? What tax evasion? Sophie smiled. She didn't have to say anything. Malcolm was figuring it out all on his own. And it was glorious. Malcolm stood frozen on the doorstep, his phone pressed tightly to his ear, his face draining of color as he processed what was happening. His accounts, frozen. His finances, under investigation. His assets crumbling beneath him. Everything he thought he controlled was slipping through his fingers like sand. Sophie sat in her car across the street, watching as the full weight of his destruction hit him like a freight train. His entire body stiffened, his free hand gripping the handle of his suitcase, as though clutching his designer luggage would somehow keep him afloat in the financial catastrophe he had just landed in. He spun back toward Isabel, still standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. You can't be serious. You're kicking me out? His voice was laced with disbelief. But there was a creeping desperation behind it. A crack in the arrogance. Isabel's lips pressed into a thin line. Her voice colder than Sophie had ever heard. This isn't my mess. Malcolm, you made this bed. Now lie in it. Malcolm's chest rose and fell rapidly as he tried to push past her. But Isabel didn't budge. Linda, don't do this. We're in this together. You have no idea what I'm dealing with right now. Oh, I have a very clear idea. She cut him off. I got a call from the Australian taxation office this morning. They want to have a little chat about all the money you've been hiding. The way Malcolm's expression shattered in real time was almost poetic. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He turned slowly, his breathing uneven, gripping his phone like it was his last tether to control. His free hand shook as he tried dialing another number. But the call went straight to voicemail. Sophie knew exactly who he was trying to call. His accountant. The same accountant who had just been informed that Malcolm was under audit. With nowhere to go, Malcolm stumbled down the front steps, dragging his suitcase behind him. He paused on the sidewalk, standing there in complete shock, the weight of his own downfall settling over him. No home, no money, no power. The world he had built on lies and manipulation had come crashing down. And now he had nothing left. Sophie watched for a moment, relishing the sheer poetic justice of the situation, before deciding it was time for her to take things up a notch. She pulled out her phone and sent a single message to Mia. "Everything in place?" Mia's response came almost immediately. "Oh, it's better than we hoped. Malcolm is officially being charged with mortgage fraud. He's going to court, and his business dealings are about to be exposed. Also, the auto has escalated the investigation. He's in deep." Sophie grinned. Perfect. Meanwhile, Malcolm was still standing there, his once expensive shoes planted on the pavement like he couldn't believe he had no place left to go. Finally, with a sharp inhale, he yanked his suitcase behind him and stormed down the street, dialing frantically, his movements jerky and frantic. Sophie didn't need to follow him. She knew exactly how this was going to play out. First, he'd try to withdraw whatever cash he could. But with his bank accounts frozen, he'd find himself locked out. No money, no way to access his offshore accounts, and no one left to bail him out. Then, he'd try calling old business partners. But those same partners were already distancing themselves the moment word got out that he was under investigation. He became a liability. Next, he'd try to fight the legal battle. But that would be difficult when he was now officially homeless. Isabel had cut off his access to their joint accounts, ensuring he had no resources to fight back. And, of course, the Australian Taxation Office wasn't done with him yet. Within days, the official audit would escalate into a full-blown investigation. Once they pieced together the scope of his fraud, he wouldn't just be facing financial ruin, he'd be facing prison time. The realization of all of this hit Malcolm that same night. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Sophie heard a knock at her apartment door. She wasn't surprised. She knew this was coming. She checked the peephole. There he was. Malcolm, disheveled, desperate, and humiliated. His usually slicked back hair was messy. His suit wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion. The man who once smirked as he stole her house was now standing outside her door, begging for help. Sophie took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and opened the door just enough to lean against the frame. "Sophie, please." Malcolm's voice was hoarse, his arrogance completely erased. Sophie tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Please, what?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "I just need a place to stay. Just for a little while. Until I figure this out. You know I'd do the same for you." Sophie almost laughed out loud. He really thought he could manipulate her. Even after everything. She leaned in slightly, her voice calm, unbothered, and razor sharp. "This isn't your home anymore." Then, before he could say another word, she slammed the door in his face. The last thing she heard as she walked away was the sound of Malcolm pounding his fists against the door, shouting her name in frustration. But Sophie? She just grabbed a glass of wine, sank into her couch, and turned on the TV. Malcolm had spent years thinking he could control everyone around him. Now, he had nothing. And that was justice. Sophie had thought Malcolm's downfall was complete the night he pounded on her door, begging for help. She was wrong. That was just the beginning of his suffering. The real final blow came days later, when everything Malcolm had desperately tried to salvage slipped through his fingers for good. It started with a phone call from Mia. "It's done," she said, satisfaction lacing her voice. "The court has officially frozen all of Malcolm's remaining assets, and the fraud charges are moving forward. He's going to be facing serious legal consequences. Prison is now a very real possibility." Sophie exhaled slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "And the auto?" she asked. Mia let out a low chuckle. "Oh, they're loving this. Turns out, Malcolm wasn't just hiding money, he was actively evading taxes on multiple shell businesses. They're building a full-fledged case against him. At this point, there's no getting out of it." And just like that, Malcolm's last lifeline had been cut. But the universe wasn't done punishing him yet. The next day, Sophie met up with Aunt Laura for coffee. "Did you hear?" Laura asked, stirring her cappuccino with a slow, amused smirk. "Malcolm tried to book a flight to Bali." Sophie arched an eyebrow. "Bali?" Laura nodded. "Guess he thought he could disappear." But then, Laura's smirk widened. "Too bad the auto flagged his passport." He was stopped at the airport. They pulled him aside before he even made it through security. Sophie nearly choked on her drink. "Are you serious?" Laura grinned. "Oh, dead serious." He was detained right there in the terminal. Sophie leaned back in her chair, soaking in the poetic justice. Malcolm, the man who had once stood in her own home, smirking as he stole everything from her, had lost everything. His money, gone. His businesses, under investigation. His lavish lifestyle, obliterated. And now? Now he couldn't even leave the country. That night, Sophie took one final drive past the penthouse Malcolm had once flaunted. It sat in eerie silence, the curtains drawn, the once luxurious entryway dark and empty. She knew Isabel was still inside, probably curled up in bed, drinking away her regrets. After freezing Malcolm out, she had filed for divorce immediately, desperate to cut ties before his legal troubles dragged her down with him. Not that Sophie cared. Her mother had made her choices. As for Malcolm, he was staying at a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, bouncing between temporary rentals, struggling to even afford a lawyer. And Sophie? She had moved on. The legal settlement wasn't enough to buy back her house, but it was enough to start over. A fresh apartment, a stable future, and best of all, peace. The weight of betrayal, the ache of injustice, it was all behind her now. She had lost her house, but she had won something even greater. Because somewhere, in a dingy room with flickering lights and the scent of cheap carpet cleaner, Malcolm was lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering where it all went wrong. And Sophie? Sophie was sleeping like a baby. Months had passed since Malcolm's world had crumbled, and Sophie had never felt lighter. She had moved into a sleek, modern apartment overlooking Sydney's harbor. A fresh start that felt entirely her own. No more shadows of betrayal hanging over her. No more stolen dreams. The legal battle had ended in her favor, with Malcolm forced to pay damages in a settlement that left him penniless. He had lost everything: his money, his businesses, his reputation, and his freedom. The last time Sophie had heard his name, it was through Aunt Laura, who had gleefully reported that Malcolm had officially been charged with mortgage fraud and tax evasion. He was awaiting trial, facing years behind bars. As for Isabel, her mother had tried, of course. The guilt-ridden voicemails came first, apologies laced with regret, pleas for forgiveness, carefully worded justifications. Then came the long, rambling text messages, each one carrying the same tired excuse: "I was only thinking of your future." But Sophie? She never answered, because the truth was, her mother hadn't thought about her future. She had only thought about her own comfort, her own gain, her own blind loyalty to a man who had stolen everything from her daughter. And that wasn't something Sophie could ever forget. And so, she cut her mother off. Completely. For the first time in her life, Sophie was truly free. No more obligations, no more family burdens, no more being used and discarded. It was just her, her work, and a brand new beginning. She sat on her balcony one evening, sipping a glass of wine, watching the sun set over the ocean, and realized she had won. Not just in court, not just against Malcolm, she had won her life back. And that was worth more than any house. Somewhere, in a dimly lit prison cell or a cheap, run-down motel, Malcolm was probably still wondering how everything had gone so wrong. But Sophie? She wasn't wondering at all. She had never been better. The story of Sophie's betrayal and revenge teaches a powerful lesson about trust, resilience, and justice. It highlights the dangers of blindly trusting family, especially when financial assets are involved. Sophie's journey proves that knowledge is power. By understanding legal and financial systems, she was able to fight back and reclaim control of her life. It also reinforces that karma is inevitable. Those who manipulate and exploit others will eventually face the consequences of their actions. Most importantly, Sophie's story shows that true success isn't about wealth or possessions, but about freedom, self-respect, and the ability to walk away stronger.